attention. I wasn't in church when he made them, but I also know that I go to church not to worship a pastor, to worship God. And that ministry, the church family that's been built there, does outstanding work, has been, I think, applauded for its outreach to the poor. He built that ministry, and I think that people need to take a look at the whole church and the whole man in making these assessments.
Did you talk to Reverend Wright recently about his decision to make a series of public appearances at this particular point?
You know, I didn't talk to him about that. I had talked to him after all this had happened, partly because I always regret people who are civilians essentially being dragged into these political fights, and I expressed to him, I said, look, we have very strong differences. I do not agree with the comments that you made. On the other hand, I regret that you have drawn so much attention, and I also regretted the church drawing so much attention. I mean, you had reporters who were coming in and taking church bulletins, the sick and the shut-in, and they were getting phone calls from reporters. And so that was something that I regretted, and I talked to him about that.
But you didn't try to discourage him from going public. It obviously isn't helpful to your campaign to have him on the public scene right now.
Yeah, I understand. But look, he is a former pastor of mine. He is somebody who has obviously been the subject of some pretty sharp attacks over the last month, and it's understandable that somebody after an entire career of service would want to defend themselves.
By the way, in your speech on race, you said that while you hadn't heard these remarks that have been public, that you had heard controversial remarks from the pulpit. But you've never said what those were.
Well, I didn't have any particular examples.
I mean, can you tell us anything that you heard him say that was...
I think that he has oftentimes talked about some of the problems in the black community in very controversial ways. I mean, I think, or in sharp ways. In ways that are provocative. He will talk about the failure of fathers to look after their children in ways that sometimes people might be taken aback by. He can use street vernacular in his sermons in ways that people wouldn't expect to hear.
But did he ever say anything about America or about white racism that troubled you?
Well, I think that he has certainly preached in the past, when I was there, about the history of race in this country. In very blunt terms, talking about slavery, talking about Jim Crow. The problem, and I pointed this out in my speech in Philadelphia, was where oftentimes he would err, I think, is in only cataloging the bad of America and not doing enough to lift up the good. And that's probably where he and I have the biggest difference. But
did you ever go to him after a sermon and say,
Well, but keep in mind, it's not as if his sermons were constantly political. I mean, I think most of the time he was talking about church and family and faith and Scripture, and that's what I got out of church. So I don't want to exaggerate this notion that somehow he was on the soapbox each and every day. The important point, though, is that I tried to make in Philadelphia is that some of this is generational. I mean, some of it is, he went through experiences that I never went through. I'm the beneficiary of the civil rights movement. I mean, people have, I think, noted that if you run back some of Dr. King's speeches, we always play I Have a Dream. But if you look at his sermon in Riverside Church, for example, when he spoke out fiercely against the Vietnam War, there are some pretty jarring comments there as well. And part of it has to do with a very specific experience of a generation that was raised under Jim Crow, saw a lot of violence, saw a lot of racial discrimination. I have a different experience and in part have a much more hopeful vision of where America has been and where it can go in the future.
Senator, you say a lot of this stuff, Reverend Wright, flag pins are distractions from the real issues, but especially for someone like you, who's a newcomer to the national scene, who people don't know a lot about, don't voters have a legitimate interest in who you are and what your values are?
Absolutely. And so the question becomes, how do voters draw conclusions about my values? Do they look at the 20 years in which I've devoted my life to community service? Do they talk about the work I did as a community organizer working with Catholic parishes and churches to bring people together to set up job training programs for the unemployed and the poor. That's a reflection of my values. Do they look at how I've raised my children and how I speak about my family? That's a reflection of my values. I don't think that the issue of Reverend Wright is illegitimate. I just think that the way it was reported was not, I think, a reflection of both that church that I attend and who I am. I don't think, let me just use another example, on flag pins. You know, I've worn flag pins in the past. I will wear flag pins in the future. The fact that I said that some politicians use flag pins and then aren't acting in a particularly patriotic way, for that to somehow be translated into me being anti-patriotic or anti-flag, I think that is a distraction. I think that that is not reflective of me or the love that I have for this country. Keep in mind, I came on the scene nationally at the Democratic Convention giving what I would say was about as patriotic a speech about what America means to me and what this country is about as any speech that we've heard in a long time.
Let me ask you one other question in this regard, which some will call a distraction, some will call values. In the last debate, you were asked about your relationship with William Ayers, the former 60s radical, and you said that you were no more responsible for what he did back in the 1960s than for your friendship with Tom Coburn, senator from Oklahoma, pediatrician, who has made comments about possibly taking the death penalty for cases of abortion. Do you really see a moral equivalency between what Ayers did and what Tom Coburn said?
No, of course not. The point I was making, and I actually called Tom Coburn afterwards because I thought that people were suggesting that I had drawn a moral equivalence. That's what wasn't what I was doing. All I was saying is that the fact that I know somebody, work with them, have interactions with them, doesn't mean that I'm endorsing what they say. And Chris, I'm sure you've got people who you serve on a board with or have dinner with who, you know, you would never expect to somehow have that seen as an endorsement of their views. Now, you know, Mr. Ayers is a 60-plus-year-old individual who lives in my neighborhood, who did something that I deplore 40 years ago when I was 6 or 7 years old. By the time I met him, he is a professor of education at the University of Illinois. We served on a board together that had Republicans, bankers, lawyers, focused on education. He worked for Mayor Daley. Mayor Daley, the same Mayor Daley, by the way, who, when he was the state's attorney, prosecuted Mr. Ayers' wife for those activities in the 60s. So the point is that to somehow suggest that in any way I endorsed his deplorable acts 40 years ago because I serve on a board with him.
Now, I'm just surprised that you brought Coburn in because it seems to me it's so apples and oranges.
No. The point I was making was that I've got a lot of people. Nobody is saying, you know what, Barack, he's got a bunch of Republican friends, or he's got a bunch of people who are considered on the religious right who he gets along with, who he shares stories with, who he does work with. The focus is on this one individual with whom I have a relationship that is far more tangential than it is with somebody like a Tom Coburn, who I'm working with all the time and who I consider a close friend. And yet that's the relationship that gets the focus.
Senator Obama, we have to step aside for a moment, but when we come back, we will ask Barack Obama about his plan to change the way Washington works. Back in a moment.
Fox News Sunday with Chris Wallace is brought to you by the people of America's oil and natural gas industry. Learn more at energytomorrow.org.
Oil and natural gas powered the past, but the future. Fact is, a growing world will require more, 45% more by 2030, along with greatly expanding